This is the video guide for the installation of the EasyKit for the Kramer guitar. There is a written guide as well, which you may prefer to use, but they are intended to be complementary to one another. Some things are easier to demonstrate or show through like a close-up picture, which would be in the written guide. Some things are easier to show, obviously, like live on a video. So if you use the written guide and something doesn't make sense, you can refer to the video guide for clarification, and the inverse also applies. If something doesn't quite make sense or seem clear in the video, you can refer to the written guide. That, at least that is my intention of the way that I've written them. So a brief overview of what you'll get as part of the kit. You will get, of course, the main EasyKit assembly. See, there's the main board here with the microcontroller with a USB-C port on it, the strum switches, the connectors, and then the wiring into the fret PCB with the mechanical switches pre-modded and soldered. You will also, of course, have 5 printed buttons, which are compatible with the mechanical fret switches. And the last part you will have you'll have a couple of these very small printed parts. These are potentially to go on the strum switches at a later stage of installation, and I will explain those further at the appropriate juncture. Of course, you will need to have some basic tools in order to install this upgrade kit onto your guitar. So I will go a quick go through them now. You will need a couple of various screwdrivers. So you will need a T10 type screwdriver. It's like a hex or a star type one. This is mainly for the body screws of actually getting into the guitar. You'll need like a small crosshead screwdriver. Um, these are for the internal screws, so for the way that the boards are fixed inside the shell, you'll need them to get those out. The last type of screwdriver you will need is some sort of fairly small flathead screwdriver. I don't know how well that comes out, but yeah, that's just for the connector terminals on the main board. The way that they secure the wires in are with these very small flathead screws, and you just need that to tighten the wires into place. Other things you will need some sort of like little wire cutters or flush cutters. These are to help you cut the wires off of the original boards. Um, you'll need some sort of wire strippers. I mean, there are various kinds and they all look quite different, and I can't cover them all, but this is the type that I have, and these will be for once you've cut the wires, you'll then strip them in preparation for them being connected into the terminals. Some sort of marker pen. This is just to help mark some wires at a later stage to help you keep track of things and make sure everything gets connected into the right place. And lastly, you may find it helpful to have something like a little bowl or a tray to put all of the screws and guitar parts in, just so they're all in one place and they don't get sprawled over, and you keep a nice clear workspace, and that helps you keep track of your progress. Now, with all of that covered, we can move on to actually installing the kit. So I've grabbed a Kramer that's off the shelf, and we're going to go straight through it. So the first step is going to be disassembling the guitar. It's come out a little bit. So we'll start with the neck. You're going to use the Torx screwdriver to open up the screws off the neck. Main thing is not to forget the two that are right down at the base. So these ones, the body shell ones, are fine normally. They will come out quite easily. And again, these are the T10 screws. There we go. Just a few more to go. So I'm just popping the screws into this tray. This one's magnetic, so that helps even further with the tidiness. Right, so those are open. So now you should be able to separate the two halves of the guitar. The next thing to do is you'll now switch over to your small crosshead screwdriver. There are two screws here. that hold the original fret PCB in place. These screws, obviously, they are quite old and they can get quite soft. So when you remove these screws, and this applies for all internal screws, not just the neck ones, it is often quite wise to apply quite a lot of downward force and just turn slowly until they come up, because otherwise the risk then is that you strip the screw, and you won't be able to remove the screw without specialized tools. So you just go lots of downward force, go slowly. You're in absolutely no rush when you do this, and they should come out without too much fuss. Um, you can then lift the wire out from that end, lift the PCB up, remove the PCB and the silicon pad, and then remove the original buttons. You won't be needing those for any remaining part of the installation, so you can set them aside. That's the neck disassembled. At this point, you may wish to stop and clean out parts of the shell if it's required. So that's the first step. The neck is disassembled. Now we will move on to disassembling the body. Quite a lot of screws to go through here, so I'm just going to crack straight on with this. The only real thing to be aware of at this step is that there is one screw under that sticker, and you will need to remove that, otherwise you won't be able to separate the two halves of the shell. So we're just going to work our way through this. All of them are T10, so you won't have any issues of needing to swap screwdrivers or anything like that. Maybe you might find it useful to decide on a particular path or pattern you follow for removing these screws, just to make sure that you've got them all. But when you try, I mean, you will know if you've missed one when you try to separate the shell. Now, sometimes, as you can see, I'm struggling to the screwdriver I have has a magnetic tip, but it is still struggling a little bit to grab onto it and remove it all the way from the shell. That's not an issue. As long as the screw is fully loose, you will be able to separate the halves, and then what you can do is just tip it over to actually separate the screw from the shell. I will demonstrate that in a moment. Alternatively, if you have a small set of magnets, you can pop them just over the screw hole and do that to remove the screw. Right, now I've just got to get at this one under the sticker. You just use your fingernail to peel that off, and you should be able to get at the screw. See, now all of the screws are loose, and for the ones that are still in there, you can just sort of tip it over, or even if they're fairly secure, you can just leave them in there. Now, when you open the shell, you'll see that there is still a wire that will connect to the battery terminal. We're not going to be using the battery. Obviously, the guitar will be wired USB when done. So you can either just tear the wire off like that, or you can choose to use your wire cutters and cut it instead. So now we are here at the stage with the shell open. We're now going to start disassembling the internals. I will zoom in a little bit just so that's a slightly better picture. the ones we're going to want to do first are these two here, and then the 4 that are in the corners of the main board there. You'll want the small crosshead to do that again. Okay, so we shall proceed with that. Again, same warning applies with the internal screws here. Go slowly with them just to minimize the risk of stripping the screws. You will notice as you extract the 4 screws from the corners of this central board here that they are slightly longer than the other ones. So remember to use those 4 longer screws specifically for the main board when it comes time for the last assembly step. Now, once those 4 screws are removed and this board is loose, there's 2 similar but equivalent paths you can take here. You can either remove the start and select board and remove the whole whammy assembly from the housing, or you can leave them in place, cut the wires, and then rather than having them loose when you do the connections, you can just keep them there and then go them straight into the terminals at that point. Both are fine. You have slightly less dexterity doing it with leaving them in, but it minimizes the risk of the buttons going missing, or the whammy assemblies are somewhat notorious for having lots of small fiddly parts, so you may wish to leave it there. I'm going to go for the option of leaving them where they are because I think that's probably what most people will prefer. So now we are going to be getting to the part where we cut these wires. The only 2 you need to cut is this one ribbon cable here, so the start and select PCB, and these 3 wires here that go to the whammy bar. I'll see if I can zoom in again. The important part here is that when you cut these wires, you want to get them in as tight and as close to the board as you can. It just gives you the most length of wire to work with when you are preparing them to go into the terminals on the kit board. If of course it does end up being that if you end up taking away too much wire, it might not reach, and then you will be in a situation where you'll need to splice some wires together, and that's sort of beyond the scope of the kit and this guide. So you're going to get in as close to you can to those wires and cut them like that, and then you repeat the same thing here, and that's done. So come out again a bit. So this part here will not be used for the rest of this guide, so it can be set aside wherever you put the other parts earlier from the neck. So that'll be the fret PCB and the buttons and such. So now that we have got the guitar mostly disassembled, so we have disassembled the body, and we have disassembled the neck. So what we're going to do at this stage, before we go straight on ahead into the installation, there's just a couple of basic checks that we're going to want to do to make sure everything fits and the rest of the steps are going to go well. Side note, you may notice that these little pegs that hold the straps come loose. You can either pop them in now or take them out, set them aside, and put them back in later. But for now, we're going to do what I call the pre-flight checks on the frets. So we go back to this part of the neck here, and what we're going to do is we're just going to take the printed buttons and just pop them into the the neck just like so, and then lift it up, and you're just going to give each one a little wiggle and make sure that through that first 2 or so millimeters it all moves smoothly and that there's no catching, or there's no it moves and it doesn't get stuck is basically what you're testing for. You can sort of do that, and if everything moves fine, that check has passed. Now again, this one might be one that's demonstrated better in the video guide. If I come in slightly, there's sometimes on some guitars there's a tiny lip on the fret casings here, and that can cause the frets to catch and bind up. So you may, in that case, need a little bit of gentle sandpapering on this curve just to get rid of them, and it should then allow the frets to move freely and without restriction. The other thing to check will be to be making sure that the fret PCB can mount on correctly. So obviously there are 2 screw posts that it mounts onto. There's one here and the one here. Now, from how obviously they were mass manufactured originally, the screw posts can receive some damage that causes them to deform, and it means that it will be difficult to put the fret PCB on, the new fret PCB on. So if you see, if I go here, it can be quite tight. This one is almost okay, but there's just a little bit, again, kind of hard to see, of deformation. You see that little bit there that's sort of sticking out to the side. So what you can do is just take like your wire cutters or flush cutters and just clip off a tiny little bit of that plastic that is stuck out, and you can then just check that the board then snaps on. With that done, that completes the fret pre-flight checks. So you can set the neck and the buttons aside for the moment. Now, this next one is the one that's kind of fiddly to demonstrate, but we're going to be doing the strum pre-flight checks. So this check is necessary because of the type of strum switches used. Obviously, the original switches used are sort of White Alps clones, which sometimes they last forever, oftentimes they can be very temperamental. So instead, we use in the kits, we use like Kale Box MX type switches. The only issue with using these over the Alps is the fact that they are slightly shorter by about 0.5 millimeter or so. Some variations are. So you might find the case that when you pop this board onto the mounts and then go over, and you might end up finding that there is a little bit of looseness at the top. And then if there is looseness, then that is what this small printed part is for. Obviously, at this stage, and when you are doing this test, be sure to hold the whammy assembly in place. Otherwise, it can fall out and cause you a bunch of grief. But yeah, so the thing you're testing for is if you pop the main board onto these mounts, hold it in place, and then just give the strum bar a tiny little bit of a wiggle. If there's a lot of sort of slack in it, then what you'll do is remove the board from the mounts, and then on the switch for the up strum, obviously I'm right-handed, so I'm going to put it on this one here. You'll take it and you'll see this has got a little cross mount in it, and it will pop just on top of the switch here. Now these are meant to be a very, very tight friction fit, so that they don't ever come loose whilst you're doing high intensity strumming or anything like that. So you will have to press quite hard to get it on, but they will go on like that. Once that's on, you can then retest, put it back on the mounts, check for looseness. If there's still some looseness after putting one, you can then take the other one of these that will be included with the kit and put it on the other switch. So then that is the strum pre-flight check completed. Now that is done, you're now going to want to prepare the wires to go into the into the main board, starting with the start and select wires. At this point, we should come in again a bit closer just so you can see. What you want to do is, can I get in even closer? There we go. Is on, obviously there's 3 wires on this. What you'll want to do is the middle one is the ground one, so just take your pen and mark that middle one with the pen like that or so. This is just so you know that it's the one that needs to go in the middle port on the connector. And then once it's marked, you can then want to split the wires apart from the ribbon. So you can take your little cutters, make a tiny little cut, and then split them further down to something that is separated about like this. Now, once those are split, I'm going to come out again a bit because the lighting is being funny. Now that it's split, the next thing you will do is take your wire cutters. These wires in the guitars range from a 24 gauge up to a 28 gauge. So and it varies between different models. So I would say if you have wire cutters that are like these, start with a 24 gauge, and if that doesn't work your way up. For other types, just be fairly conservative with the pressure you apply so you strip the wire without cutting it. So you're going to want to strip, say, roughly 5mm off there, and that should leave some wire exposed. And then you're just going to repeat that for the other ones. About 5mm and strip. About 5mm and strip. There we go. Now these are stranded wires, so what you may find it helpful to do is to twist the wires just so that way that the strands don't splay out everywhere as you work on them. That's the only thing about keeping these in place. So it might be an idea at this stage actually to unscrew this PCB for the start and select board. This one again tends to mount on quite stiffly, but it will come loose. Once it is loose like this, you can just take the one particular wire, give it a bit of a twist, and that will keep the strands tidy, and then you can repeat that for the other wires too. So I'm just grabbing the tip of the wire that we just exposed from the stripping and twisting it so that they're all now nice and tight, and then we should then go into the terminal block slightly more easily. Now probably then best at that point you just pop this one back on there, and you can then re-screw it back in. Do that one. So now those wires are prepared and ready to go into the terminal. Now you can repeat the same process again for the whammy wires here. Probably the best time to do it. Again, the other important point of this step is to remember that which color of the wires is the center one. The common theme between both this bit and that bit is that the center wire has to go into the center slot in the connector. So as long as you make note of that, or you want to mark it with a pen again, you can do so. Again, we're just going to strip about 5mm off of these wires. There we go. And then These wires are slightly longer, so it's easier to twist them to keep them tight and organized without having to remove the entire assembly. Right, so our wires are ready for connecting in. So now you will need to go and get your main board and then just pop it onto the mounts here, just loosely. It doesn't have to be screwed in just yet. We will start first by doing the wires for the start and select. So as I've mentioned, the important thing is to get the middle wires in first. So here is what you'll do. You'll take it and there will be a small hole in the terminal that you will want to insert the wire into. And it should go a fair way, like pretty much close up to the end of the insulation. Once it's there, now it is time to get your small flathead and tighten the corresponding screw in the terminal, as this is what's going to secure the electrical connection. So you're going to tighten it. It will go a fair way, and you want to tighten it till it's just, you just feel it start to tighten, and then if you give a gentle, very gentle tug like this, just to confirm that the connection works. Now that you've got the first one in, you can repeat this exact same process with the other two wires for start and select. So take it, you'll insert it into the terminal. Of course, I'm coming slightly a cropper as the strands are coming apart, so I didn't twist that quite enough last time. Now I do. You can always pull these wires back further to separate them out a little bit more, and that should give you a little bit of extra dexterity to work with them, because they can be fiddly. So again, insert the wire into the terminal. Should go a fair ways in. Flathead screwdriver to tighten it down until it just starts becoming tight. Give a very gentle tug like that to ensure that the connection is there. And then last wire for the start and select board. And insert it all the way in. Small flathead just to the where you start to feel tightness. Gentle tug to ensure that the connection is secure. Right, so then that bit is connected in. So then the next step will be, we'll be repeating exactly the same process, but just with the whammy wires instead. I will do what I should have done beforehand and split them down a bit further, just because it gives you a little bit more dexterity when trying to insert these relatively small wire tips into the terminal blocks. So again, we'll go with the middle one first. So inserting into the terminal, push it a fair way in, tighten the screw above it. You see I'm doing the middle screw for the middle wire. Go until you just start to feel tightness, and a very, very gentle pull to check that the connection has been made. We're going to go do the outside one next. Again, repeat, it goes into the thing, small flathead, turn it clockwise till you just feel some tightness, and it's then secured. Last one, then we'll go into the last connector slot, and you'll then tighten it up like so. Gentle tug, and we know all of the connections have now been made, and therefore we are ready now. All of the electrical connections have been made now, so we're ready to do some initial reassembly. So what I suggest we do at this point is come out so you can see a broader picture again. The next step will be to mate the two front halves of the guitar together. So you'll slot the neck into the front half of the shell like so. Obviously, it is worth remembering that this guitar will be hardwired by the time you have finished installing this kit. Then, once you've mated those two halves together, pop the printed buttons into the slots, like so. And then what you'll do, once those are there, it's time to secure the fret PCB onto the mounts there. So you'll pop it in onto those screw mounts that we looked at before. And then what you do, you go back to your screw tray and you will get those two small crosshead screws. I grabbed the wrong screwdriver because I foolishly forgot I changed the bit out for the flathead. But no worries. I'll come back in just so you can see. We're going to put these two screws back in now, which are small flatheads that you extracted earlier. So one goes there, and then you'll do the same again over here. You don't have to tighten them that tight. You can probably go to within like a half turn of full tightness, and that will work absolutely fine. And it will also mean that if you ever want to take it out again, you don't have you mitigate the risk of stripping again. Only thing else to bear in mind is when you put this in, just make sure those wires aren't like over that thing, this post here, because that's one of the posts for the back half of the shell, and if they're in the way, they can get caught and smushed. So just make sure those are out of the way. So with those installed, you're then going to move back down to the body with your small crosshead still in hand. You're now going to want to have those four longer crossheads again, and those are now going to be used to secure the new main board in place. So I suggest doing diagonally opposite corners first. These ones you can do quite tightly. And there we go. Those four screws are now assembled. At this point, if you remove the whole whammy assembly earlier, you will slot it back in. If you did what I did and left it where it is, then it's already done and ready, and you don't need to do anything else there. So the next thing to do will be we are now going to route the cable that you're going to be using. So some sort of USB type C cable to the controller. Now, as you've seen, there's this little part here at the bottom of the guitar. This is where like the on-off switch originally used to be. So what you can do, you can take that part out, and then this part here that covers the slide switch, you can just pop that out, and that should then give you a very convenient place through which to run the cable. So then that goes in there, then you can run your cable in through there. At the moment, you can just run it straight into the controller because we're just going to do some initial setup and plug it in. If you've got any loose strap pegs at this point, you can pop them back in place like so. Now, we're now at a step where we were going to, what I tend to do, and I would advise you do the same, is you partly close the shell up, but with only 1 to 2 screws in the neck and 1 to 2 screws in the body, just in case you need to get into it again to correct something that you may have missed earlier. It just saves you the hassle of having to undo all of the screws in case there's one tiny thing that needs changing before it's completely finished. Now, as it's a hardwired guitar, we have to close the neck up first. So we're going to focus back on the neck. Now, again, if you look at the neck shell here, there's a tiny little tab you might see here that can sometimes interfere with the new hard wires. So you can just bend that out of the way and that won't obstruct it. Then you're going to take the back half of the neck and it should then slot on like so. You're then going to take your T10 screwdriver, and I suggest doing one screw there and one screw there. Again, this is just the temporary measure for allowing you to hold the guitar properly whilst you run through the configuration steps in the software. So 2 screws there. Right, so that's the neck temporarily secured. So then we come back to the body, and now we shall temporarily close the body up. So we're just going to pop that, and everything should just pop right into place. And I'm going to do, again, 2 screws as a temporary measure. Sometimes it can be a little bit more difficult to shut the shell up just because you have the whammy mechanism sort of prodding at it. So you may wish to have like one hand underneath it as you tighten up the screws. So we've got the one screw that goes in there, again T10, and then I would just do one other screw towards the top of the body. So now this is like loosely held in place with the buttons installed. And so then what you'll do is you'll then go into the configurator software, which you will be provided a link and a guide on how to install it. There will, at that point, there's a separate video that I have made, and that separate video is a guide on how to use the software to correctly bind the start, the select, and the whammy bar. I haven't put it in this one video because I am technologically impaired and can't figure out how to set it up properly on OBS so that you can see the window capture. So that is in a separate video. So this is where you've gotten to the sort of like initial reassembly. You'll then go away to the other video, which I will link below in the description, to do all of the settings and calibration for the buttons. So that once you've done that and you've come back and you know you've got your start button bound, your select button bound, your whammy bar bound and calibrated, all that is left to do is to do the final assembly. So that is just going to be a matter of putting all the remaining screws in. The only thing being is that there are 2 screws right at the base of the neck that you want to put in, but you can't access them while the back is closed. So you're just going to undo the 2 screws that you did in the back. See, that's a lot quicker than having to undo a whole bunch of screws just to get at the neck. We'll come back over here. So now this step here, all we're going to do is put the screws back, all of the remaining screws back in the neck. So do the 2 down at the base. Again, you don't have to go super tight on these ones. Another thing, I don't know if you can quite hear it, but it's often a good idea to try and get the screws into the original threads they're in. So what you might want to do when you put these screws in, if you turn it anti-clockwise slowly, and if at some point you will feel it sort of like almost like click, that's it falling into the path of the original thread, and then you can just screw it in down that way, and you should find there will be a lot less resistance when you do so as well. Just go in like that. Do. Only a couple left to do because we've already got those two in there. And then there's just this one left to do at the top. Right, coming back to the body. The last thing we want to do before closing up the body is it's a good idea to route your USB cable in a way that gives it some strain relief, so that in the case that you, like, I don't know, trip on the wire or tug on it, it's not going to cause any damage. So what I suggest you would do is the cable, you'll route it. There's a post here which originally supports the battery pack, but obviously there's no batteries involved anymore. Route it around that. Come down here. There's a tiny gap here between a mounting post and a bit for the original on and off button. Go through there. So you've got a sort of like reverse S shape that goes around that one, through that gap, and then out of the slot you made. Again, this is the last chance to check that that's wedged in place, and to make sure that all of your strap pegs are in place. So then we just take the shell. Everything should pop together pretty nicely. Again, you may have to have your hand underneath it here just to give you a bit of space, to not have the whammy assembly poking the shell open. And again, just going to reinstall all of the screws on the body. Just going to go around. And you see me going anti-clockwise slowly to find the thread, and then clockwise when it's clicked into that, just to make sure those posts are preserved. Go in, there we go. There's one screw still in there from earlier. I'll say it's worth taking your time just when you put these screws in, just to make sure you don't like smash up the threads, because you're almost done. There's no need to rush across the finish line, as it were. And that should be the last screw. So you may have two screws left over. Those are the two screws that would originally have mounted the on-off switch there. Obviously that's not needed, so you will have those left over. But then once that is all done, you can come out, and now you have a completed mechanical threat, upgraded strum bar, wired USB Kramer. That is the guide on how to install the Kramer EasyKit.